Imagine, if you will, the intoxicating atmosphere of Tokyo in the late 1980s. It was a time when the laws of gravity seemed to have been suspended by a sheer, blinding force of capital. If you stood at the intersection of Ginza, you weren't just standing on a street corner, you were standing on the most expensive soil in human history. The statistic was repeated so often it became a mantra of national pride. The grounds of the Imperial Palace alone were estimated to be worth more than the entire state of California. Japanese corporations were not just competing, they were conquering. Sony had bought Columbia Pictures, planting the rising sun flag atop Hollywood. Mitsubishi had purchased the Rockefeller Center, the very soul of American capitalism. To the casual observer, it looked like the ultimate triumph of the East, a reversal of the outcome of World War II, fought this time not with aircraft carriers, but with semiconductors and sedans. But peel back the neon-drenched veneer, and you would find the seeds of a Greek tragedy being sown in a conference room on the other side of the world. Let us rewind slightly to September 22, 1985. The setting was the Plaza Hotel in New York City. The atmosphere was deceptively cordial, filled with the clinking of fine crystal and the murmur of diplomatic pleasantries. The finance ministers of the G5 nations, US, UK, France, West Germany, and Japan, gathered for what seemed like a standard bureaucratic adjustment. Noboru Takeshita, the Japanese finance minister, walked into that room believing he was finally claiming Japan's rightful seat at the high table of global superpowers. He thought he was buying respect. In reality, he was signing a death warrant for the very engine that had brought Japan to the party, its manufacturing dominance. The agreement, the Plaza Accord, was framed as a cooperative effort to depreciate the US dollar. It sounded technical, harmless, almost boring, but in the world of grand strategy, it was a financial guillotine. The paradox is brutal in its simplicity. To please the United States and avoid the threat of protectionist trade tariffs, Japan agreed to let the yen appreciate. They effectively agreed to make their own products twice as expensive for the rest of the world to buy. Almost overnight, the export miracle that built modern Japan was suffocated. The immediate aftermath was not a crash, but a hallucination. As the yen skyrocketed, the Japanese suddenly felt incredibly rich. Their purchasing power exploded. They went on a global shopping spree, buying Van Goghs and French chateaux. The domestic government, terrified of the slowing export sector, slashed interest rates to historic lows to keep the economy moving. This was the Faustian bargain. The cheap money didn't go into building better factories or researching better chips, because Japanese exports were now too expensive to compete. Instead, that ocean of liquidity poured into speculation. It flowed into stocks and real estate, inflating a bubble so massive, so grotesque, that it detached the Japanese economy from reality. While the salarymen in Tokyo celebrated their newfound paper wealth, the foundation of their nation, the monozukuri, craftsmanship spirit, was being hollowed out. They were trading their industrial future for a fleeting moment of financial superiority. They were eating their own seed corn, believing it was a feast that would never end. The Plaza Accord, therefore, was not a treaty of peace. It was a masterstroke of American economic statecraft that managed to do what no military could. It convinced the world's rising challenger to voluntarily dismantle its own primary weapon, all while handing them a glass of champagne to celebrate the suicide. This is not a story of economic numbers. It is the story of how a nation won the world, only to lose its soul in the transaction. To understand why a sovereign nation would essentially sign its own economic suicide note, we must leave the plush carpets of the Plaza Hotel and descend into the gritty, desperate realities of 1985. The decision to manipulate the yen was not made in a vacuum. It was forged in a crucible of political survival, driven by men who were playing two very different games on the same board. In the United States, the mood was not one of triumph, but of visceral anger. While Wall Street was beginning to hum, Main Street was hemorrhaging. The policies of Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker, the inflation slayer, had worked too well. By jacking up interest rates to crush the inflation of the 1970s, Volcker had inadvertently turned the US dollar into a magnet for global capital. The dollar was strong, muscular, unassailable, and utterly destructive. For a banker in New York, a strong dollar was a badge of honor. For a steelworker in Pittsburgh or a tractor manufacturer in Illinois, it was a death sentence. American goods were simply too expensive. Caterpillar, the pride of American heavy industry, was being decimated by Komatsu. Detroit was watching helplessly as Toyota and Honda devoured their market share, not just because the Japanese cars were better, but because the currency exchange rate acted as a massive subsidy for Japan. The pressure cooker in Washington was about to explode. In the halls of Congress, politicians were waving sledgehammers, literally and metaphorically. Democrats and Republicans alike were drafting over 300 protectionist bills. The rhetoric was venomous. There was talk of a uniform 20% surcharge on all imports, a move that would have sparked a global trade war reminiscent of the 1930s. President Ronald Reagan, the champion of free markets, was backed into a corner. He needed the Japanese to buy U.S. debt to fund his Star Wars defense initiatives against the Soviets, but he could no longer ignore the screams of the American voter. He needed a valve to release the pressure, and he needed it before the midterm elections. His Treasury Secretary, James Baker, a master political operator, saw the solution clearly. We don't close our borders, we force them to raise their prices. Across the Pacific, the view was starkly different, yet equally precarious. Prime Minister Yasuhiro Nakasone was a rare breed in Japanese politics. Tall, charismatic, and fluent in English, he was a stark contrast to the gray, consensus-building bureaucrats who usually ran the country. He dreamed of a normal Japan, a nation that was not just an economic merchant, but a respected political power with a seat at the geopolitical table. But Nakasone was walking a tightrope. Within his own party, the Liberal Democratic Party, LDP, the knives were out. The LDP was a snake pit of warring factions, and Nakasone's grip on power was slippery. He needed a major diplomatic victory to silence his internal rivals. He needed to show that he was the only man who could manage the most important relationship in the world, the alliance with the United States. This gave birth to the famous Ron-Yasu friendship. The press loved the photos of Reagan and Nakasone sharing laughs at Camp David. But behind the smiles lay a brutal power dynamic. Japan was an economic Godzilla, but a geopolitical dwarf. Under the security umbrella of the United States during the height of the Cold War, Japan had no military leverage. Its entire prosperity was built on access to the American consumer. If Congress pulled the trigger on those protectionist tariffs, the Japanese miracle would vanish overnight. Nakasone knew the numbers. He knew that Japan's massive trade surplus was politically unsustainable. The Ministry of Finance, MOF, and the export lobbyists fought him tooth and nail, terrified of a stronger yen. But Nakasone saw the bigger picture, or so he thought. He believed that by yielding on the currency issue, he could buy insurance for Japan's security and prevent the U.S. markets from closing. The tragedy of the players lies in their mismatch of intent. The Americans were playing a game of brute force correction. James Baker didn't care about the structural health of the Japanese economy. He wanted to fix the U.S. trade balance and silence the Rust Belt protectionists. He viewed the negotiation as a transaction. Devalue the dollar, save the American factory. The Japanese, however, were playing a game of status and appeasement. They viewed the Plaza Accord not as a financial restructuring, but as a membership fee for the club of Western superpowers. They believed they could manage the stronger yen through efficiency and innovation, Kaizen, just as they had survived the oil shocks of the 1970s. There was a fatal arrogance in Tokyo. The Japanese bureaucrats believed their economy was invincible. They thought they could manipulate asset prices to cushion the blow of the currency shift. They didn't realize that the U.S. wasn't just asking for a currency adjustment. They were demanding a fundamental rewiring of the global financial architecture. So, when the delegates arrived at the Plaza Hotel, the table was tilted long before they sat down. The U.S. brought the threat of market annihilation. Japan brought a checkbook and a desperate need to be liked. The Americans wanted to export their inflation and import Japanese capital. The Japanese wanted to export their goods and import American security. Both got what they wanted in the short term, but only one side understood the long-term price of the exchange. As the ink dried on the agreement, the trap snapped shut. The iron triangle of Japanese politics, politicians, bureaucrats, and big business thought they had dodged a bullet. In reality, they had just swallowed a slow-acting poison. The stage was now set for the mechanism of transfer, where hard assets would be swapped for paper promises, and the future would be sold to pay for the present. The Monday morning after the Plaza Accord was signed, the global markets did not just react, they convulsed. The era of the cheap yen, the secret fuel that had powered Japan's post-war rocket, was over. In its place came a new, brutal reality known in Japan as endaka, high yen. If the Plaza Accord was the declaration of war, the mechanisms that followed were the tactical airstrikes. This was not a simple currency adjustment. It was a complex, multi-layered extraction of wealth and potential, disguising a structural dismantling as a financial boom. The speed of the shift was violent. Within 2 years, the value of the yen doubled against the dollar, moving from roughly 240 yen to the dollar to 120. To the average Japanese citizen, this felt like a miraculous promotion. Suddenly, their money was worth twice as much abroad. The salaryman who saved for a decade could now buy a condo in Hawaii or a luxury handbag in Paris for half the price. It felt like Japan had finally won the game of capitalism. But for the captains of Japanese industry, the men running Toyota, Sony, and Matsushita, this was a catastrophe. Imagine you are a Japanese exporter. Yesterday, you sold a Walkman for $100 in New York, and you brought back 24,000 yen to pay your workers and invest in your factory. Today, you sell that same Walkman for $100, but you only bring back 12,000 yen. Your costs haven't changed, but your revenue has been sliced in half. To survive, you have 2 choices: raise prices and lose the American customer, or keep prices low and bleed cash. Japan chose to bleed, desperate to hold on to market share. But to stop the bleeding, they had to make a sacrifice that would change the nation's DNA forever. This is where the true transaction took place. It wasn't just money changing hands. It was the future capacity to produce. Squeezed by the crushing weight of the high yen, Japanese corporations realized they could no longer afford to manufacture made-in-Japan goods for the world. They were forced to pack up their factories and leave. This phenomenon was grimly named kudoka, industrial hollowing out. In a twist of strategic irony, the United States didn't just stop Japanese imports. They forced Japan to build the cars inside America. To bypass trade friction and hedge against the currency, Honda built plants in Ohio. Toyota set up shop in Kentucky. This was the hidden cost of the transaction. Japan transferred its legendary production efficiency, its management secrets, and its job-creating machinery directly onto American soil. They were training their own replacements. The physical assets, the factories, the machinery, the supply chains, migrated across the Pacific. Japan was retaining the headquarters and the bank accounts, but it was losing the industrial muscle that acted as the spine of its society. While the corporations were scrambling to offshore their factories, the government was being cornered into a structural trap. In 1986, under intense pressure from Washington to reduce the surplus, Prime Minister Nakasone commissioned the Maekawa Report. To the uninitiated, it looked like a standard policy paper. In reality, it was a blueprint for cultural suicide. The report argued that Japan's traditional virtue of high savings was actually a problem. It demanded that Japan shift from an export-led economy to a domestic consumption-led economy. The U.S. effectively told Japan, "Stop saving, stop working so hard, and start spending like Americans." But you cannot simply command a nation of savers to become spenders overnight. You have to force them. This leads us to the final, most destructive mechanism of the transfer: the interest rate trap. Terrified that the Endaka recession would destroy the economy, and bound by the promise to boost domestic consumption, the Bank of Japan, BOJ, slashed interest rates to historic lows, 2.5%. They opened the floodgates of liquidity. The government essentially handed out free money, but because the factories were leaving, hollowing out, nobody wanted to borrow money to build a new plant in Osaka. Why invest in manufacturing when the yen is so high? So where did all that cheap money go? It went into the only assets that couldn't move: land and stocks. The transaction mechanism was now complete. The U.S. had successfully neutralized Japan's export advantage. In return, Japan was given an unlimited supply of cheap credit. The Japanese banks, awash in cash they couldn't lend to factories, started lending to real estate speculators. A vicious feedback loop began. A company would buy land. The land value would skyrocket. They would use that land as collateral to borrow more money, to buy more land. The Zytec, financial engineering era, was born. Major electronics companies began making more profit from trading stocks than from making electronics. Japan had traded its hard power, manufacturing dominance and savings, for soft hallucinations, inflated asset prices. They had swapped the solid ground of industrial production for the thin air of a financial bubble. The mechanism was perfect. The U.S. got the factories and the cheap capital, as Japan bought U.S. treasuries. Japan got the inflated ego and the paper wealth. The transfer was not a robbery in the night. It was a sophisticated financial surgery that removed the patient's heart and replaced it with a pacemaker set to overdrive. By 1988, Japan was no longer just an economy. It was a hallucination. But beneath the surface of this gilded age, a far more sinister reality was taking shape. The United States and the Western financial powers hadn't just changed the exchange rate. They had fundamentally redesigned the geometry of the global playing field. They enticed Japan away from the solid ground of manufacturing, where the Japanese were undisputed masters, and lured them into the volatile deep waters of financial capitalism, where the Americans were the sharks. This was the structural trap. For decades, the soul of Japan was monosukuri, the art of making things. The structural integrity of the nation was built on tangible value: steel, silicon, precision engineering. In this world, 1 + 1 = 2. But the post-Plaza environment introduced a new alien logic: Zytec, financial technology. Japanese corporations, finding their export margins crushed by the high yen, stopped looking at their assembly lines for profit and started staring at their balance sheets. Why struggle to squeeze a 3% margin out of a Toyota Corolla when you could make a 20% return by parking corporate cash in the stock market? Major manufacturers began morphing into hedge funds. They weren't investing in new R&D centers. They were investing in golf courses in Pebble Beach and office towers in Shinjuku. The structure of the economy shifted from value creation to value extraction. Japan was like a heavyweight sumo wrestler who had been convinced that his strength would translate perfectly to ballet. They were playing a game they didn't fully understand, against opponents who wrote the rulebook. The trap was compounded by Japan's own internal structure, the keiretsu. Historically, these massive conglomerates, like Mitsubishi, Sumitomo, Mitsui, were Japan's greatest strength. They were families of companies: a bank, a manufacturer, an insurer, a trading house, all owning shares in one another. This cross-shareholding created an impenetrable shield against foreign takeovers and ensured stability. However, in the bubble economy, this shield transformed into a systemic suicide pact. Because Company A owned shares in Company B, and Company B owned shares in Company A, when the stock market rose, both companies looked artificially richer. They counted these rising share prices as capital. It was a house of mirrors where reflections were counted as real objects. This structure allowed them to borrow astronomical sums of money based on phantom capital. The banks, sitting at the center of these keiretsu, were not impartial lenders. They were family members giving unlimited credit to their drunk brothers. There was no due diligence. There was only the incestuous flow of money within a closed loop, inflating the balloon to a size that defied physics. Anchoring this entire precarious structure was a single, fatal religious belief: the land myth, Tochi Shinwa. The structural flaw in the Japanese banking system was that it didn't lend based on cash flow, the ability to pay back. It lent based on collateral, the value of land. The collective delusion was that land prices in Japan could never fall. This created a perpetual motion machine of debt. A corporation would buy a plot of land in Tokyo. The next year, the value of that land would double. The bank would see the increased value and say, "Great, here is more money." The corporation would take that loan and buy more land. It was a Ponzi scheme sanctioned by the state. The banks became bloated with assets that were priced at fantasy levels. They were not holding solid loans, they were holding dynamite. But because the entire system, politicians, bureaucrats, and tycoons, was profiting from the rise, no one dared to check the fuse. While Japan was drunk on this internal party, the Western powers quietly tightened the screws from the outside. This is the most overlooked aspect of the trap. In 1988, the Bank for International Settlements, BIS, introduced the Basel I Accords. These were new global regulations requiring banks to hold a certain amount of hard capital against their risks, an 8% capital adequacy ratio. On the surface, it looked like prudent global regulation. In practice, it was a sniper shot aimed at Tokyo. Japanese banks were allowed to count a portion of their stock market gains as capital. As long as the Tokyo stock market stayed high, they met the global standards. But this rule weaponized the stock market against the banks. If the stock market ever crashed, the Japanese banks wouldn't just lose money. They would become legally insolvent by international standards. This was the trap snapping shut. The West had encouraged Japan to inflate a stock market bubble, and then wrote a law making the Japanese banking system dependent on that bubble remaining inflated forever. By 1989, the trap was absolute. The Bank of Japan knew the bubble was dangerous. They knew they needed to raise interest rates to cool it down. But the structural trap meant they couldn't. If they raised rates, the stock market would fall. If the stock market fell, the Keiretsu Cross shareholdings would devalue. If the shareholdings devalued, the banks would fail the Basel capital requirements. If the banks failed the requirements, they would stop lending. If lending stopped, the land prices, supported by credit, would collapse. Japan was paralyzed. They had built a machine that could only move forward at breakneck speed. It had no brakes, only an accelerator and a self-destruct button. The leaders of Japan, the Iron Triangle, sat in their offices, watching the numbers climb higher and higher, paralyzed by the knowledge that any attempt to fix the system would shatter it. They were no longer running the economy. They were hostages to it. The system was rigged so that the only way out was through a total collapse. And as 1989 drew to a close, the finger was hovering over the button. The date was December 29th, 1989. It was the last trading day of the decade, and the Tokyo Stock Exchange was electric with a kind of religious ecstasy. The Nikkei 225 index hit an all-time high of 38,915.87. Champagne corks popped in the boardrooms of Marunouchi. Bonuses were handed out in envelopes thick with cash. The consensus was absolute. The 1990s would belong to Japan, just as the 80s had. The index was predicted to hit 60,000 within a year. But unknown to the revelers, the executioner had already entered the building. His name was Yasushi Mieno. Just days before the peak, on December 17, 1989, Yasushi Mieno had taken over as the governor of the Bank of Japan. Unlike his predecessors, who were often viewed as pliable bureaucrats willing to keep the printing presses running for the sake of political harmony, Mieno was a hardliner. He was a man of cold, austere principle. Mieno looked at the glittering skyline of Tokyo and saw not prosperity, but a moral and economic cancer. He believed that the bubble was destroying the soul of Japan, rewarding speculators while punishing honest workers who could no longer afford a home. He famously declared that the Japanese economy needed to be dried out. He didn't just want to cool the economy, he wanted to purge it. While the rest of this country was drunk on cheap credit, Mieno reached for the one lever that could stop the party: interest rates. The establishment expected Mieno to be gentle. They were wrong. In a rapid-fire series of aggressive moves, Mieno hiked the discount rate repeatedly, dragging it from the basement levels of 2.5% up to 6%. For a bubble economy that was breathing pure oxygen, this was like cutting the air hose. The reaction wasn't instantaneous. Bubbles rarely pop with a single bang. They hiss, then violently implode. At first, the market arrogantly shrugged off the rate hikes. Japan is different, the brokers said. The land prices justify the stock prices. But the math, as it always does, eventually asserted its dominance. In early 1990, the gravity of the rate hikes took hold. The cost of borrowing money for speculation suddenly exceeded the potential profits. The greater fool theory, the idea that you could always sell your asset to someone else for more money, evaporated. The crash began in the stock market. It was a slow-motion car crash that accelerated into a pile-up. By October 1990, the Nikkei had plummeted from its peak of nearly 39,000 to below 20,000. 50% of the nation's paper wealth was incinerated in less than 10 months. This was the moment the structural trap from Part 4 triggered its lethal mechanism. Remember the Plaza Accords? Japanese banks were counting their stock market gains as capital. When the stock market crashed, the bank's capital base was wiped out. Overnight, the mightiest financial institutions in the world were technically insolvent. To survive, the banks stopped lending. They slammed the brakes on the economy. This was the credit crunch, kashishiburi. The contagion spread from the screens of the stock exchange to the physical ground. The land myth, the belief that Japanese real estate could never fall, was the next to die. Developers who had borrowed billions to build golf courses and office towers suddenly found their funding cut off by the paralyzed banks. They couldn't finish their projects. They couldn't pay their interest. They were forced to sell. But who was buying? No one. The market went no bid. Land prices didn't just dip. They collapsed. In prime districts of Tokyo, real estate values fell by 70%, then 80%. The collateral that backed trillions of yen in loans was suddenly worthless. The yusen, housing loan companies, began to topple like rot-infested trees. The financial bloodletting was horrific. Golf club memberships, which had been traded like securities for millions of dollars, became worthless pieces of paper. The middle class, who had taken out multi-generational loans, 100-year mortgages, to buy tiny apartments, found themselves trapped in negative equity, owing far more than their homes were worth. The psychological shock was perhaps more damaging than the financial one. The Nomura securities scandal and other corruption cases surfaced, revealing that the big brokerages had been compensating the mafia, yakuza, and favored corporate clients for their losses, while leaving the average retail investor to rot. The veil of honor was ripped away. The Japanese public realized the game had been rigged all along. Corporations began the painful process of restructuring. The lifetime employment system, the bedrock of Japanese social stability, began to fracture. The salaryman, the warrior of the economic miracle, became a figure of pity. As 1991 turned into 1992, the denial faded, replaced by a deep, melancholic stagnation. The end of history had arrived for Japan, but not in the way they expected. They had not conquered the world. They had been seduced by a financial mirage, and when the water receded, they were left stranded in a desert of bad debt. Yasushi Mieno had succeeded in drying out the economy, but he had also inadvertently mummified it. The bursting of the bubble didn't just reset the cycle. It broke the transmission mechanism of growth. The banks were now zombies, alive only because the government kept feeding them, but too dead to support new businesses. The collapse was total. The Japan as #1 era was dead. The lost decades had begun. If you walk through the Marunouchi district of Tokyo today, you will not see ruins. You will see pristine streets, polite crowds, and trains that arrive with the precision of a Swiss watch. It is a society of immense wealth, safety, and comfort. But if you listen closely, you can hear the silence. It is the silence of an ambition that was extinguished 30 years ago. The Plaza Accord was not merely a diplomatic agreement, it was a watershed moment in the history of power. As the dust settled on the collapse of the 1990s, the final audit of this silent war began to emerge, revealing a geopolitical masterstroke that reshaped the world. So, who truly won? The United States emerged as the undisputed victor, executing one of the most successful strategic pivots in history. By crushing the Japanese manufacturing juggernaut through currency appreciation, American industry was given breathing room. But more importantly, while Japan spent the entire 1990s paralyzed by bad debt and zombie companies, the United States was free to reinvent itself. While Tokyo was busy hiding losses, Silicon Valley was busy inventing the future. The 1990s became the decade of the American Internet boom, the era of Microsoft, Netscape, and Amazon. Japan, weighed down by its financial hangover, missed the digital revolution entirely. The Walkman was replaced by the iPod, not because Sony lacked the technology, but because Sony lacked the risk appetite of a confident nation. The torch of innovation had been forcibly taken back across the Pacific. Japan, conversely, entered a gentle stagnation. It did not become a third-world country. It became a wealthy nursing home. The lost decades were not a period of starvation, but of spiritual attrition. The fierce, aggressive Japan Inc. that terrified the West was replaced by a risk-averse, deflationary society. The generation of corporate warriors gave way to a generation of herbivore men, Soshoku Danshi, young men with no desire for career advancement, marriage, or material consumption. The ultimate legacy of the Plaza Accord is a brutal lesson in the nature of sovereignty. It proved that economic power without military and political independence is an illusion. Japan was an economic giant, but a geopolitical vassal. Because it relied entirely on the United States for its national security, it had no leverage to say no when the U.S. Treasury demanded it commit economic harakiri. The Plaza Accord was the moment the United States reminded Japan that money is not power. Power is power. Japan attempted to buy its way to a seat at the table, but they found out that if you don't own the table, you are on the menu. Could it have been different? If Prime Minister Nakasone had refused the accord, the U.S. likely would have imposed severe tariffs. There would have been a trade war. It would have been painful. However, a trade war is an external battle. The Plaza Accord was an internal poison. By accepting the currency manipulation, Japan destroyed its own internal mechanism of value creation. A trade war might have hurt their profits for a few years, but the Plaza Accord broke their psychology for a generation. Today, the ghosts of the Plaza Accord haunt the halls of Beijing. The Chinese leadership has studied this period of history with obsessive detail. They view the Plaza Accord as the American trap, designed to decapitate a rising challenger. This is why China refuses to float its currency freely, and why they are pivoting to military self-reliance. They are determined not to become the next Japan. In the end, the Plaza Accord stands as a monument to the ruthlessness of great power competition. It is the story of how a superpower used the intricate levers of finance to dismantle a rival without firing a single shot. Japan remains a beautiful, functional, and civilized nation. But it is a nation frozen in time. A Galapagos economy that traded its dynamic future for a permanent, comfortable twilight. The signature on that document in 1985 didn't just change the price of the yen, it changed the destiny of Asia.